Okay, welcome to Chapter 6. So Chapter 6 is kind of in the middle of this process. Chapter 5 was you're starting over from scratch and you got nothing. And you build what's called a relational model, which is a relatively simple, designed so you could show it off to people and say, is this the data we need to collect? And is this, does a customer have to have an order? Those kind of things. So you get to ask questions about, one-to-one and one-to-many and minimum. Does it have to have this or is it optional to have that? Those kinds of things. So those are really good pieces of information that you need at the beginning. But Chapter 6 is nudging it a little bit closer to actually building a real database. So the two major things that we're going to talk about in Chapter 6 is the data types. Okay, in other words, is it a number, is it a string, that kind of stuff. Whether or not it's optional or required field. Like the address. Does everyone have to have an address? That kind of thing. And then lastly, the placement of the foreign keys and primary keys as well. Okay, so those are the major topics that we're going to be dealing with. So, the introduction, once again, start talking about the relational database design on ERD, okay? And so, what it takes to translate this guy, this entity relationship diagram. How do you translate that into something that has a little bit more data? For example, we can't see, we can see primary keys, we can see foreign keys, but we can't see the data types and we can't see whether or not it's required. So we're going to tweak this diagram to add the stuff that does not already exist. Okay, so the things you would go through, the steps you would go through to get from point A to point B is you create the tables, okay, create the relationships, which primarily means, the foreign key stuff. And then enforcing minimum cardinality, where I go in there and say, is this optional or, is this, that kind of thing? All right, cool. So on page 274, they start talking about this one more time. So a relational database design, which I conveniently call this relational model. I don't like calling relational model and relational database model. So I call this a logical design. It just keeps the words a little simple. Okay, so the entity relationship diagram basically should be vendor neutral. They shouldn't be doing anything in Chapter 6 which ties you to Oracle or ties you to SQL Server or MySQL or whatever. Now there is one exception to the rule that we're going to use coming up here shortly, and that's picking the data types. So every database vendor could do things slightly different. So I'm going to concentrate on the SQL Server stuff, and I'm going to point out to you whenever things are off in other vendors. Okay, so just kind of be paying attention for those cues. By the way, the textbook doesn't actually follow this logic quite as tightly as what I've described here. So let's just begin. So back to Visio. Yes, I can see the PK and I can see the FKs, but I cannot see, for example, the data types, and I cannot see whether or not it's required. And that's what we're going to be doing. So we're going to be adding some stuff. We're going to be adding the data types. We're going to be adding the null or not null, meaning it's required or not required. We're going to be adding perhaps an alternate key and maybe an auto number kind of a thing. And maybe we'll be making some annotations here that there's some other type of constraint. Maybe we won't put the entire constraint there, but we'll just put a little note saying, hey, has a constraint. Okay, kind of makes sense. All right, so the first thing we need to do is talk about the data types. So typically when you're putting together one of these things, you create the table for every entry, right? You specify the foreign key, the primary key, that's fairly obvious. Specify any alternate keys or candidate keys, remember that term? And then specify the properties. It's got to have a name. It's got to have whether or not it has null or not null, which means required or optional field. The data type, like is it a number, is it a date, is it a string? The default, if any, and the data constraints, if any. So this is what you have to do on each one of these guys. And then, of course, verify that you didn't make any normalization mistakes along the way. And then step 2 we talked about was creating the relationships. So, between strong entities, between ID dependents and mixed relationships and basically recursive relationships. We know all do that. Basically, we're talking about, connecting a foreign key to a primary key. and then specify the logic for enforcing. Is it a optional, mandatory, those kinds of things. Okay, shoo. So the first thing we need to do is create a table for every entity. All right, we've kind of sort of already done that here, right? We've created a table called customer. Cool. And in relational notation, one more time, I'm going to bring this thing up in WordPad. I probably should just put WordPad on my thing here. Okay, so in a relational notation, customer, and then you'd have, cust ID, and then, first name, right, last name, bunch of other stuff. And then remember, this guy is underlined because he's the primary key. Okay, you remember all that stuff, don't you? Good, okay. So the first thing we need to do is select a primary key. Well, first of all, does the primary key have to be the first column in the table? I mean, is there a rule that says the first column must be the primary key? No, it's not. However, most people do it this way. Most people do use the primary key first. And therefore, just to maintain some sanity, I would recommend you also do it this way. Just saying. Okay. So what are the rules for doing a primary key? So in this case, I have a customer, and we could have a customer ID, and let's go ahead and put the email address down here, and maybe some other stuff. Okay, so I basically have a choice here. I could use the customer ID as a primary key, or I could use the email. So why would I use one versus the other? Well, here are the rules. Hey, I like rules. Whenever I say, here are the rules, you ought to be paying attention and taking notes. So it really should be short. If you had a choice between something that was really big or really small, pick the smaller one. It really should be numeric if possible. Like my customer ID is numeric, and email clearly is not going to be a number. It's going to be a string, right? If you have strings, it should be what's called fixed length. Now, we haven't talked about what that means yet, so just bear with me. That means instead of having the right margin, be able to change back and forth between the line lengths, it's always exactly so many characters long all the time. Again, we'll talk about that again. And then if all else fails, I can't there's no number, and I can't make it short. Well, maybe I ought to go ahead and just consider one of those synthetic surrogate auto number kind of things, and just have the machine provide the primary key for me. I kind of like the idea of a customer ID because, I know, customer Bob is customer ID 1234. It just kind of makes sense to me. Okay. So in practical terms, the value of a primary key really should never change. Whenever you create a primary key and, assign Bob 1234, you should probably never ever go in and change that number to 1235. And there are some databases where primary keys are immutable. Ooh, how's that sound for a cool word? Where you can't make changes to it. So this is not a hard and fast rule, but it definitely is a best practice rule. Okay, so now I need to figure out a way to do alternate keys. Remember we talked about alternate keys? So let's go here. I'm not going to say, in fact, why don't I just minimize that guy? So here, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add me another doodad. So I'm going to insert, and I'm going to put the email here. Okay, so I need some way of doing this. So since Visio really can't help me here, I'm just going to basically put in parentheses AK for alternate key. Okay, that's just a technique. And if it was a compound primary key, compound alternate key, then it may be like AK1, AK.1 or AK.2. I know it's a little ugly, but this is a way of telling Visio how to include the pieces of information that it normally does not do. Okay, so there's some notation here in the book talking about, AK 1.1, that kind of matches that guy, AK 1.1. Here's an AK 1.2. So name and city together and the email address. So, customer number or the email address, and then they went ahead and, added some extra stuff. Okay, so here's a technique for showing alternate keys. Good, okay. The next step in that 3-step process, well, actually the next portion of the first step in the 3-step process, is we're going to go in there and specify the properties. So primarily we're talking about the column properties are going to be things like the data type and whether or not it's a required field. Okay, so for example, do you have to have an email address? How about this? Okay, I'm going to do a little bit better one. I'm going to go ahead and do, so a lot of times you'll have like an address, you'll have like 2 address lines, right? Because some people have, 123 Any Street, apartment 4, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to have an address 1 and address 2. And let me go ahead and throw in a city here too. I'll stop at that, but that's close enough. Okay, so is the first name required? Yeah, I'm thinking so. Last name? Yeah, I'm thinking so. Address? Yeah. Address 2? Not necessarily. So I need a way of saying that this guy is not required. Now, believe it or not, Visio does have a thing for that, but I'm not using that. Okay, we're going to do it with text. Okay, so I need a way of doing this. So what I'm going to say here, I'm going to go up to the first one, and I'm basically going to say not null, like that. Okay, that means it cannot be null. And I'm going to go to this guy and say not null. Okay. So this one is not null. I'm going to do some video magic here. Okay, so I made 2 of these things optional. The customer ID is not optional, nor are there, but the address 2 is optional. A null, it will allow a null, and you don't necessarily have to have an email address. So I made those 2 optional. Okay, cool. All right. And the next thing is the data type. Now this gets a little complex. I mentioned that you're trying to build these things without a particular database in mind, particularly a database member. So I went in and said, okay, well, I'm going to use the ISO data standards. Great. So let's just go look at what the ISO data standards is for this stuff. So here is what the honest to God real ISO varying, car varying, and character, and the one I typically use is this national character varying. And I said, that is way, way too much typing. I am not going to type in national character varying. Sorry, I ain't doing it. So I am going to use the Microsoft SQL Server abbreviations for these data types just so that they don't consume all of my Visio chart. So this is one of the exceptions to the rule. Most people can understand this. Okay, so let's look at what the choices are. So I know this is kind of an eye chart. You might have to zoom in a little bit. So basically you have a bit data type, and that's basically for true, false, yes, no, that kind of thing. Tiny int, it's just for a small number, and then int, and then big int, and then decimal, and then numeric, and money, date and time, date time, etc., etc., etc. And then there's, for strings, you have a choice between a character or a varying character. Character means fixed length, meaning it's always going to be exactly 17 characters long no matter what. And then, varying would mean like for your first name, where I have no idea how long your first name is. Is it this long or is it this long? So it varies. So the character varying. And then the inversion, in char and in varchar, these are designed to use the latest Unicode data alphabet. In the old days when we were king and we built databases, we used our own English character set, which basically has like 120 something characters in it. But when you go to other countries, that just flat didn't work. And so we needed to widen the character set to make it allow for a heck of a lot more characters, which is what Unicode is all about. So I basically don't use the non-in versions. I don't ever use char and varchar. I use in char and in varchar because I want my database to always work no matter where it goes. Okay, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark. You know how this works.